Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you at the last session today. This is a session with young global leaders. Please allow me to welcome brains of future and today. I would like to invite here Mrs. Vera Kobalia, who is here, please. She was a former Minister of Economy and Sustainable Development in Georgia. Then please, Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, who is chair of the Paulina Foundation and investor, deals with environment and education. And Ms. Katarzyna Pisarska, who I don't think I need to introduce. She's director of the European Academy of Diplomacy. I'm very happy to have this very exciting session on future of Europe, I would say, and the crisis that we are dealing today. I mean, I must say I was very concerned about Europe before I had Mr. Barroso, who actually very much uplifted me in saying that we are not in such an awful situation. So I'm not sure if this session is still necessary, but it was a very positive ending. However, we must admit that we have varied challenges to our European security and Europe as a whole today. There are internal challenges that we have spoken about already. We talked about Brexit, we talked about the Greek crisis, we have spoken about different problems related to Russian aggression, about Daesh. We perhaps haven't mentioned Africa and the problem of demography. I think there are a number of different challenges that we are tackling today. And I'm very happy to have those very bright people in front of me that are going to give us answers how to solve the most or the biggest problems that we are facing today in Europe. So I actually wanted to start with first internal problems that the EU is facing. We have, of course, economic problems. We keep on saying that there are a number of issues related to recession that we are tackling in the European Union. So my first questions would go to Andre, who is an expert in economy and financial issues. Can we just fix Europe? An economic crisis. Is it possible? If there is a recession coming, is there any possibility to actually make policy makers to react, and how could they react to the economic challenges that we are facing today?
I think probably Goldman Sachs is better adapted than me to answer to that question, but no, joke apart. First, thank you for the introduction. It's always difficult to be called a young global leader, but what I think is a real proof of leadership is that you rarely have panels with 75% of women, so I think I want to appreciate that, and well done. So that's the 21st century, and that's good. No, on the economy, I mean, I'm investing in Europe, in European innovation, and I try to scale companies internationally because I think growth is even more important than money. As was said before, I mean, the ECB is flooding Europe with money. What we need is growth, and growth means value creation, means jobs. And there's always something which strikes me is that when you're in Beijing, you are, where I spend most of my time, you're convinced and some people try to convince you that Europe is done, finished, etc. But I always remember that is that we represent 30% of Chinese exports, and China represents 3% of European export. So we always tend to minimize a little bit our role, but today it's still the largest market. It's a market which is not growing very fast, but it's the largest market in the world. So I'm not so sure that the economic topic is the most important. The one thing I would disagree with what I heard just before is, and to build on this economic topic, I think the economic topic is the issue, because when you have 50% of the wealth in our capitalist systems, which is owned by 1% of the people, you have a problem. And that's what the Brexit people tell us, and that's probably what the Trump people tell us. You might be surprised that the private equity man has that, but I think if we're really long-term, if we really want to be long-term and make our systems sustain on the long term, we need to bring everybody with us. And we should not allow authoritarian states especially those far in Asia, show us that on the surface, they can lift much more people out of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this, for me, the economy, but also the system, how it's inclusive and how it's fair, that's the real issue, rather than just macro growth number. Because when there's 1% growth in Europe, I would suspect that it's minus for some and for a lot, and plus 10 or plus 20 for a few.
So you're saying that actually externally, especially in Asia, we are not foreseen as being in such a big economic crisis, and there's still, our role is still influential in those.
I'm always amazed to see that it's the outside people who keep telling us, don't be so bad about yourself, and that's why I also hope the discussion today will be more not just looking at our own problems, and more looking at how can we project, I mean, how can we think long term, how we can, of course, think about the eastern borders. I mean, I'm a newcomer to this region of the world, so I'm struck by the tension that there is here. We have Africa on our border. I mean, I'm both French and German, so you see that makes me a very bizarre animal, but think about Africa. Africa, and that's where my German countrymen finally understand it, is long-term an immense opportunity in the same time zone, so the investor in me likes that. He doesn't need to have this terrible jet lag, but if we don't solve, if we don't have a short-term view, it is a massive issue, because the migrants will just become more and more. You just have to see the figures. So what Europe could be and should be from an economic point of view is this long-term beacon. I don't want to monopolize the topic here, but if we can discuss a bit about how can Europe do a little bit less, but doing much better the areas where sovereignty is truly there only if we bring things together. I strongly believe the topic here in Europe is not about the European issue, it's about how the democratic system adapts, and also how do you relinquish power to Brussels, but also bring also much more local involvement. And if we can bridge that, then we will win. If we don't, I'm pessimistic.
I do agree that very often we are very critical in the EU, and we use also this excuse of economic and financial crisis to actually stop our actions externally. And I feel that this is one of the major problems we have with our eastern neighborhood, for example, that we talk about our internal challenges that we are facing in order to excuse perhaps some kind of a lack of reactions in certain areas. And I feel that was perhaps a case of not such a strong action that we should have taken in our eastern neighborhood. And I wanted to ask Vera here, do you think that EU is to a certain extent losing credibility when it comes to the East, or we can somehow still regain it?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for giving me a chance to speak today. And I would like to speak from the local, regional perspective, from Eastern Partnership's perspective, because I am Georgian first, and I worked in Georgia. But today I work, and I'm working in Indonesia, and I'm advising Indonesian government on economic policy. So I would like to take it a bit further as well, and to continue on Andres' point of how not only regionally but globally we look at EU. And regionally, I think that it's very important for us, and I say us because I believe Georgians associate themselves and think of themselves as Europeans. So I think that we have to not take it for granted who our friends are and who our allies are. And if you take Georgia 10, 15 years ago, there was, and you looked at the polls, you would see that there was a huge support for one day becoming a part of the European Union or a member of NATO. And generally, there was a lot of aspiration to get closer to European values, and it's still there. But we have to understand that when we we are having these conversations, and these conversations take a very long time to turn into actions, then there are other players that come into the room and provide other opportunities that are much quicker. And people are individuals. At the end of the day, they have families, they have to think about individual issues, and they sometimes choose the prosperity or the better opportunity of today versus the long-term visions of tomorrow. So even though it's good for us to speak about European values and what they provide, we have to also provide action and assistance today. So if we want the European neighborhood to be supportive of the vision and the direction, then we also have to support it with actions. And one example is the visa-free, as you know, situation that has been going on between EU and Georgia. And even though we are moving in that direction, but it has been taking so long that it created a lot of unnecessary discussion and propaganda coming in from Russian media discussing why it's not happening. So, so we're just giving a playing ground to others to take their time and provide additional opportunities for propaganda. So this is from the European partnership perspective. And then from the Asian perspective, where I am based right now, I agree with Andre that Europe matters, and European Union matters a lot still. But again, and it was said quite a few times over the last couple of days, is that we have to show with actions that what we're saying is going to happen, because what we're seeing right now in Asia is that from their view, so one example would be, for example, and I'm going to take a step back and talk about, so the issue of, for example, I'm working with Indonesian government on the issue of corruption in institutions. And they want to reform. And they want to change their institutions and become more transparent, but they keep seeing all these polls coming in and questions coming in from Europe and America, where young people, and the World Economic Forum just recently did a study with Global Shapers, with a community of under 30s. And the millennials, the young people, have said that the biggest challenges for them in across the world is corruption in government institutions. So, and the only countries where people have not said that the corruption is top one issue was Canada and Australia. So then the Indonesians or other countries in Asia ask the question, well, why are you expecting us to make changes here if you have exactly the same issues back at home? So to conclude, what I'm trying to say is that we have to make sure that we not only provide the voice of reason, but we constantly reform ourselves and change ourselves in order to be truly that shining star.
Okay, thank you. I do agree that this is one of the major issues for the EU, of course, in the Eastern Partnership countries to support reforms and tackling corruption. But somehow I feel also that because we are having so many internal problems and not always we can actually agree on the common action on the EU level, we are not perceived as being very credible. And therefore, my question here comes to Katarzyna, perhaps. How can we overcome this perhaps lack of solidarity, coordination, and the leadership problems at the EU level? I know that the leadership issue has been discussed a bit, but I think it's very valid when we talk about tackling the crisis inside the EU in order to project a current coherent vision outside.
So Joanna, let me take a step back and start with saying that I'm a huge proponent of the European integration project. Imagine that for a moment there, that actually we would be able to tomorrow end the war in Syria. that not only the war ends, but we can find a solution between the different sides and actually some kind of a peace broker. Then we are actually in the Middle East able to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we solve the Sunni-Shia divides, we see a big organization, economic organization growing within the Middle East that actually starts to unite all Arab and non-Arab countries. And in the wake of 2 or 3 decades, this is the most peaceful and prosperous region in the world. And this most prosperous region in the world starts to have some cracks after a few decades. Well, that is actually what happened in Europe. In 1945, we are not that different from what is today happening. Of course, there's a lot of differences in terms of specificities, but when you think about what the European Union project has done to the continent, it has brought together countries that were historically divided in ways we cannot imagine today. I think the Middle East, is the best example of when you look at it, and when you think about it, there was no reasons for it, but the history has went the direction it did. So we cannot stop and continue we have to continue to say this is the most wonderful peace project the world has ever seen, and to lose this would be the most stupid thing we could do. Now, your question is, what's happening? Why do we feel there is some kind of, decline? What are the key structural problems? And I think, again, this was said by President Barroso, these problems are wider than only Europe. First, there is a breakout of trust. I think a lot of people do not trust in the West each other, institutions, politicians, financial corporations. They stop even trusting their own, communities. So I think we have to look at this. What happened that in societies that were naturally trustful, and I remember still in the 90s going to the West and saying, my God, these people are so naive. I don't have to even show a document and they'll believe anything I say. And coming from a post-communist country, that was a shock because everybody would verify everything because nobody trusts anybody in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. And in the West, it was enough for you to say, hi, I'm Kasia, and they was great, nice to... So this kind of trust is a hallmark, I think, of the West and the European Union. And we're seeing a break in this, but we're also seeing a lack of vision and leadership inside of the European Union, and I think this is even more painful. As long as you were able to speak to the people and tell them, this is where we're going, this is what is there also in for you and for your children, this is a joint co-ownership project, people would follow. Today, they don't feel there is leadership, they don't feel there is the charisma, the ideas behind it, and it's pretty much true when you look at the leadership. I think Angela Merkel is the only one standing there in the European Union. So to conclude, I mean, where should we start? And I think the solutions should focus much more on regaining trust, on trust building, and how to do it in a practical level. I have been advocating for many months that the most important thing we should do in the current crisis is to focus on a few issues, priority issues. It can be 2, 3, 4 issues that really matter for European citizens. It can be energy security, it may be immigration, digitalization, the tangible benefits that people really see. I loved the idea, that every European that finishes 18 years old will get a free train ticket, Europass, to travel across Europe. The roaming that is going away, many of these things, if we could actually build that narrative and speak about the benefits that the European project gives, I think we would be much better off.
Thank you very much. I agree with you completely. I'm also a very profoundly committed European. That's why I work for the EU. But my concern about the trust is actually it's not only European problem. This is everywhere in the world. People are more fearful because they don't understand the changes that we are facing today. So it's the same in the US, it's the same in Canada, it's the same in many societies where people are just too afraid of the fast pace of changes and that we are facing. And this is a big problem. What I fear about the EU is that people do actually not understand it. This is one of the problems because it's very complex, and the EU is complex, and the large number of challenges are also very complex. So they're not very simple type of challenges. They're multifaceted, they are very diverse. And people are scared because, of course, you always are scared of something that is really unknown to you. So that's the first issue. But the second problem is how do we actually bridge this gap between people and policymakers, because of course all those initiatives that you mentioned, they are there for people, and there are many, many examples. I mean, if you look at European research area, if you look at roaming, if you look at many other projects, I mean, they're all for people and they are there, but people don't understand that they actually exist. So how do we communicate the positive aspects of Europe to citizens?
I'll just one thing to what you said, the question of globalization. I think we should start communicating that the European Commission is one of the best protectors of European markets from the negative forces of globalization. Because of its immense role in regulating the internal market and protecting it on a number of levels throughout the last decades, it has actually been able to grow the European market in the way. So maybe we're just not speaking the right words. We should be saying, yes, the European Union is allowing us to better adapt to the globalization processes, and it is protecting us from a lot of the negative consequences. It might not be able to protect us from all the consequences. Nobody is, let's face it. But I think we also should start to look at where people are really, of what they are really afraid of, and discuss these issues. Because if we don't do it, the populists do, and we know how that ends.
Sure, please.
I mean, let me share a thesis with you, because I have the impression that both with President Barroso and in this discussion we're still remaining a little bit at the fringe. My feeling is that if, and I completely agree with what Kasia just said, but my feeling is that if we keep just trying on the communication, we're just going to convince a room, which I'm sure we are all convinced. The whole question is, how do we bring those who are now voting for the populists on both sides? And my feeling is that the democratic systems, the crisis we are feeling in Europe is not a crisis of Europe. It's a challenge of our democracies in a world where, which is very schizophrenic. On one side, issues are massive and cannot be solved at a national level. Migrants, defense. I like the word about defense is not divisible. Or protection. And on the other side, never before, there was this discussion about, you know, the propaganda, just the panel before, never before people have been so well informed. And I think a lot of politicians still are lecturing their electorate. And I think the electorate, even those, I would make the assumption, voting for Trump, are better informed today than I have ever been informed. The question is, how do you combine, so there's a need for big topics, and I think globalization that should be a perfect topic where the EU can show that it has a protective aspect, because a lot of people have been left over of globalization. I think we need to insist on that. And look at just the map of the Brexit, and you will see where this industrialization happened. Not in the city of London, but not so far from it. And on the other side, a lot of people are yearning for local, and I can only be struck that more and more, I mean, my French part is from Corsica. It's an island. I feel that Corsica, Catalonia, Bavaria, I don't know the provinces or the regions in Poland enough to say that, are today very relevant for education, for infrastructure, for local engagement with people. And my thesis I'm doing is I think the crisis we are seeing today is that nation-state politicians are asking themselves, what is their relevance? Because on some topics they're powerless. Maybe Merkel is an exception, but even her, she needed the help of other nations and it didn't come. And on the other side, if things come from top down, you just have to see the distance that there is today between Berlin and Munich to just see. So I think we need to reconcile, and it's a structure of our democratic systems that probably we need to think about. Maybe some topics need to have 10 years mandates. Education, for example. And I'm getting frustrated that it's authoritarian states like China who begin to show the way and have the luxury of thinking long term. And they will win if we don't invest in education and infrastructure, in digital. And on the other side, there are other topics where I don't want to give a president a 5-year mandate, because 5 years today is so much longer than 5 years, 10 years ago. So maybe we need to think about systems where we don't just wait for this charismatic leader who will solve all our problems, but where we need to distribute power in timings and in regional level, which are the closest to where the problem actually are. I'm bringing a problem, I don't bring a solution, so apologies.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Vera, you would like to share your...
May I
yes,
add a few points and continue on Andre's points as well. So I've been reading lectures also in European universities, and I see more and more students asking me, and those that have no experience of war or what communism means or what it means to live under communism. And for some reason they have this views that socialism maybe is not such a bad thing. They also think that maybe democracy needs to be redesigned, because look at those authoritarian states that can make decisions so quickly, and look at Putin, even though he's not a positive character, but at least he's a leader for his country. So I get a lot of these questions, and they're more and more not even questions, but actual arguments from them, saying that we need to make changes. And also young people that live in a world where economies are working much differently, where we have shared economies, where we have, Uber becoming one of the biggest companies in the world, and then we look at our democracies and we look at our government systems, and they're still operating in the same way that they were operating in 19th century. So what Andrea was saying about revisiting and looking outside of the box, and we're the group of young global leaders, so maybe we should start this conversation where we should, first of all, encourage more young people to go into politics, because when I work with governments, I see that there is real hesitation for young people to go into politics. And main reasons when I ask them, the reason why they don't want to go into politics is, one, they can provide a much better life for them on the private sector, so salaries do matter. Second is that they don't want to be tied to a specific political party, so because when you're tied to a party, it's for the rest of your life in a way. And in some countries, more underdeveloped countries, it's a huge issue then with the career aspirations in the future. And the third point for them is privacy. They don't want to lose their privacy in the era of social media and everyone inquiring and wanting to know about your life on a daily basis. So how do we deal with all these challenges that they have in order for us to provide them an opportunity to join the political systems and governments and make changes? Because if they don't join, we're left with mediocre solutions at the end of the day. And secondly, how do we revision the way our government institutions work? Is it providing different, so we're thinking very short term, because election cycles are always making us and forcing us to think about elections versus long-term thinking. So how do we revisit that as well?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I would like to open a floor. Are there any questions to young global leaders? Do you have any? Well, if not, I still have many. Yes, please.
Okay, it's working. Well, I've asked too many questions this conference, but thank you very much for the presentation, Marcin Buzanski from Pulaski Foundation. It's fascinating to listen to you, and I agree with most of what you have said. What I haven't heard yet, and I'd like to hear from you, is when you say how do you engage as new leaders with the population? How do you enter politics when you're young? How do you move the local closer? And how do you kind of go back into understanding the project that we have and that it's at risk? My question is, what do you propose? What is, I mean, you know, if it's ideology, is that division? I mean, what's clinging to that identity? What is that next step? I mean, this has been our little end of history around here, which has been shaking up. But as kind of states, I don't see a vision which comes with the political, you know, messaging. It's not like you're fighting for freedom, or it's not like you're regaining it. It's not like you have to completely rebuild your economy. It's a, you know, it's this kind of uncertainty and lack of the political idea, whatever it will be, that you would sell. So your take on that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
I can start because, you know, that's something I give a lot of thought, the practical solutions. But I think, you know, we have become very complacent. I think we have been extremely lucky in Western Europe and for 25 years also in Central Europe to have what we have. And it's very difficult to move and shake people around a positive idea, in a way. It seems, and it's also a new generation. I mean, I love the millennials, don't get me wrong, but I think that we have also raised a generation that is expecting that everything will be delivered to them, and they will not have to do too much effort to get what, you know, their parents had, what their grandparents fought for, and so on and so forth. So sometimes in the, you know, in the darkest moments of my life, I think maybe we have to lose some of it to actually start to understand what we have and what's worth fighting for. But I wish we don't get to that point. And that in order for us not to get to that point, we need to start to think about very practical solutions. And I still believe that, you know, the idea of a united Europe is a very attractive concept. And I think a lot of the young Europeans, because we're talking about the young Europeans, are not willing to give up this idea. You saw this in the Brexit elections very well. I mean, the majority of young people either voted for Brexit or forgot to go to vote. Yeah, these two things. But in general, they were assured that it's impossible for the UK to go out. And of course, there will be more open borders, less visas in the world, that it's a never-ending, you know, a cycle of actually coming closer, globalization, and so on. Yes, there's a lot of tensions in the societies, and I think the only hope is in the young. And I think a lot of the young, particularly in Western Europe, they have this bigger globalized vision of the world, but they're not ready to fight for it yet. Maybe we need to moment
on Facebook.
Maybe we need to, yes, maybe we need to, exactly, they fight on Facebook. So maybe we need to see things going, you know, worse before they actually start to go better.
Maybe if I can answer to that with 2 points. I don't know if you read President Obama's interview with Wired, which is a high-tech magazine in San Francisco, about the future of technology. Artificial intelligence, how technology is going to change our life. It's not just about the geekiness, but it's really how society is going. And remember what I mentioned to you before, I think a lot of politicians still infantilize voters, and especially the young generation. I would dream of European leaders who stop, I know it's important, but stop talking about six-pack, three-packs, whatever packs, and banking union. I know I'm not going to have, these are not the vision that we need. Leave that to the technocrats and the technicians, very important. Think about how Erasmus was a real project. Think about how we are in a world where we all feel that if we defend lifelong, or like we say in France, CDI, you know, the unlimited contract, we're just fooling people, because that's not the way we're going. Think about we could make a real vision around lifelong learning. I mean, we all feel that what we learned 10 years ago, apart from the soft skills, is useless today because it's changing so fast. There you can really get not just the young, all the progressive people around you. I don't hear that topic. And there we are really in a leadership topic. The only politicians who do that, and I would say, Kasia, we also need to go beyond the, I would say, the the vision of the united Europe, but what does this mean? It's a vision for the rest of the world. This capacity to project ourselves. Each time I'm in a panel outside of Europe, people are minimizing, talking about the euro crisis. Who cares? What we care is about what is the vision that the Europeans will bring to a world where probably you don't want to be completely Chinese, and sometimes the US is a bit too, you know, black and white, between the good and the bad, and we don't want to be the ugly, obviously.
And if I can make a last point is we shouldn't also be afraid of looking at best practices and examples from other countries, even if they are more developed or less developed than us. And one example is on today's Economist cover is Canada. And I grew up in Canada. I'm also Canadian. And I think Canada does a very good job with many of the issues that have been discussed over the last couple of days. And just recently I was speaking to the mayor of Calgary, who was sharing his experience and understanding how Canada manages so well to integrate not only refugees, but also create a sense of right nationalism in the population, and then closeness to your neighbors, and without issues of them being of different ethnicity or so forth. And he told me a story about how they came up with an idea of 3S. And what 3S means is 3 services that you can do. And Andre, you probably know this. So 3 services that you can do for your country, for your province, well, in Canada, for your city and for your neighborhood. And because our environments are changing so much, because we are working in different environments, we are more flexible, we have more time, we, in a couple of years are going to have autonomous cars, we don't need to drive, so we will have more and more time. How do we dedicate this free time? And we should provide more services that are coming from our hearts, from our emotions. And those services, he says, in Canada and in Calgary specifically, allow these people to interact with each other, with their neighbors, with their communities, and get closer to those communities and understand that actually there's nothing wrong with being of a different nationality or of different ethnicity. So, yes.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm very uplifted listening to you. Thank you very much. One of our speakers needs to leave now to catch his plane. I'm very much uplifted listening to your visions and your having all this positive energy that comes from you on how to change, how to improve. And I think all of us should take from this session this need of a service, of doing something at the smallest even level in order to change our environment for better. So I need to wrap up the session. Thank you very much to all my speakers, and thank you very much for listening and participating.